Welcome. Well, it's a real pleasure to have Jordi Diez here today for the last talk in the IDS lecture series of the semester. So welcome to the event. It's been a great series so far. I've got to say it's a real pleasure to have Jordi speaking here. I think I've known Jordi now for at least 11 years. Yeah, something like that. What are we now? We're the old crowd or the veterans?
We're the veterans.
Okay. And sadly, I think this is the first time I've seen Jordi speak since his job talk about 11 years ago.
Wow.
So it's great to have this opportunity again. And by way of introduction, I was thinking back to sort of those days when he first came to the department. And I had the privilege then of being on Jordi's hiring committee. I don't know if you know the intricacies of university hiring committees, but often you get all sorts of information, obviously reference letters, etc., about the candidate. And I'll never forget this. In Jordi's file, there's a letter from one of his advisory members at the University of Toronto, and I won't name any names because it's all confidential, but according to her, Jordi was the best student she'd supervised in, I think it was 20 years of work at the university. And so we certainly were very happy to bring him into the department at that time. And I remember too, in your job talk, he was working on environmental policy back then. And you made the case that in looking at environmental movements and environmental policy, it wasn't just a study of how environmental policy is implemented, but also a test of democracy and democratization, in this case in Mexico. And I think the same can be said about your current research project on the politics of gay marriage in Latin America, that in many ways it's going beyond just the inner kind of dimensions of that movement, but also looking at what this means for democracy, human rights, and social movements in the region. Okay, so that's my little informal introduction. More formally, I'll give you an idea of the things that Jordi has done and who he is. Jordi Diez is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Guelph. He received his BA and his PhD from the University of Toronto and his MA from the University of Essex in the UK. Professor Diez is taught at the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, Sciences Po, and the University of Toronto, and has been a visiting professor at the El Colegio de México, the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago de Chile, and the University of California, San Diego. Professor Diez teaches in the area of comparative politics, Latin American politics, comparative judicial politics, and the politics of sexuality. His research interests are varied, and he has published on environmental politics and policy, North American security relations, civil-military relations, social movements, comparative public policy, presidentialism, and gay and lesbian politics. He is the author or editor of 5 books, and he held the 2014-15 Peggy Rockefeller Visiting Scholarship at Harvard University. So please join me in welcoming Jordi to the IDS.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. With that introduction, I'm a bit nervous. Thanks very much. It is a pleasure to be here to give the talk. I'm wrapping up about 20 talks that I've given on the book throughout the hemisphere. Please keep quiet. on the hemisphere, and it's really nice to do this. My last talk here on campus here at home. So it culminates, a book tour that I've done throughout the hemisphere. So it's great to be home, and it's great to talk about this book, which is the culmination of a lot of work. It actually represents about 8 years of work, field work in about 4 countries. Over a period of 5 years, about 250 in-depth personal interviews. And one of the reasons why it has taken me so long is because it has been a moving target. Few of us would have imagined, scarcely 7 years ago, that the idea of gay marriage was actually going to be a reality today for 62% of Latin Americans, right? So the majority of Latin Americans now have access to gay marriage. So when I applied for funding back in 2006, the title of the application was sexual rights in Latin America writ large, right? And as the debate on gay marriage started to heat up, I decided to focus on the topic. So it really is a pleasure to share with you the findings of all this work. Okay, so gay rights. This is a little outdated, but at one point when you study gay marriage, you have to just give up because it changes so much that it's just impossible to keep track. Just a couple of changes. Of course, the United States, now it's all dark blue, as is Mexico, as is Brazil, and Chile over here would be light blue. So what we have here is gay rights throughout the world. I, in my work, inspired by the work of Isaiah Berlin and his negative and positive liberties, divide rights into two categories. It is positive rights and negative rights. Negative rights is the right to be left alone, not to have the state intrude into your personal life. And positive rights are the rights that are expanded to give you some goods. Right? So what we have here is two different shades. Dark blue is where gay marriage is legal, with the changes that I described. Light blue-gray is civil unions. On the other column, what we have is pinkish, which is countries in which homosexuality is criminalized. And dark red is a country where it is criminalized by the death penalty. Right? So it gives you a landscape of the world. What can we get from that? Well, a couple things. First, that if you look at the hemisphere, right, the Americas, it is pretty blue, right, with the difference of English-speaking countries, right? And the reason for that is that Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries adopted a civil code of Napoleon of 1804, which never criminalized homosexuality, right? Whereas the former colonies that were colonized by the British criminalized homosexuality. Right? So those are colonial legacies. And you have here Belize, over here, technically Belize, which is essentially a Caribbean country. So except for that, you see that it's fairly blue. Right? If you look at other parts of the world, Africa and the Middle East are pretty red. Right? So you see some differences. Now, if you divide the world into global south and global north, what you see is that Latin America is quite blue. The only country outside Latin America in which gay marriage is allowed is South Africa, with a Supreme Court ruling, constitutional court ruling in the late 1990s. But it is the only country right, outside Latin America where these relationships are allowed. What does that do? Well, it actually challenges some of the deeply and widely held stereotypes about Latin America being conservative, Catholic, and very machista, right? It really doesn't break that out. But something else that stands out is that within Latin America, right, you see a high degree of heterogeneity. Right? There's a great deal of variance. Yeah? There's a great deal of variance here, and this is what I wanted to explain. Right? A basic comparative research design here is what explains that in some countries you have seen the advance of gay rights, whereas in others you have not. It's a basic comparative exercise. The other thing to note, though, worldwide, is that what you see is two parallel processes, right? Challenging the ideas of modernization. That you see the advancement, the extension of some rights in some countries, but you see the stagnation and the retrenchment of some of these rights in other countries. And that would be some African countries in which bills are being debated to restrict rights, Russia, some Eastern European countries, and some of the Balkan countries as well. Yeah, so we have two parallel processes taking place as well, which is what the Economist last year in October referred to as the gay divide, right? So you see cross-current phenomena where some countries are pushing for gay rights and others are retrenching gay rights. So essentially here, the research question that guided my book was what explains then, what are the factors that explain that some countries have advanced gay rights, whereas others have not. And here what I'd like to do is to give you a very general overview of some of the main countries, main in terms of size and industrialization, to just give you an idea of where we stand in terms of gay rights. The first one is Argentina, is a precursor of gay marriage. It adopted gay marriage in 2010. It's the first country in Latin America to adopt it at the national level, and the 10th in the world at the time. Now we're around 20 countries. The very interesting thing about Argentina is that unlike other countries, the process was not judicialized, as it was in Canada and as it was in the United States. It was a process that went through the legislature, right? So it was not the court. The courts, and I'll explain that later on, placed the issue on the agenda, but it was really a policy that was debated, pushed by gay and lesbian activists in Congress, and passed, right? So it was not forced by the courts, which makes it very, very interesting. The other was Brazil, which is complex because it's very judicialized. In the case of Brazil, the gay and lesbian movement has not had gay marriage as a priority. They have fought for hate crimes legislation, and they have fought for civil unions, and they have framed it as an issue of socioeconomic rights. You need civil unions in order to have access to socioeconomic rights. Brazil is a federal state. We have 4 federal systems in Latin America: Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, and Argentina. Brazil is one of them. The rest are unitary systems. And in Brazil, what the movement has done, they have pushed for civil unions and socioeconomic rights at the subnational level, because the civil code, right, is at the subnational level. In Argentina, sorry I missed that, it's at the national level. So you have a national civil code. So to have gay marriage, you just need to reform the civil code at the national level. In Brazil, it's at the subnational level, and they've pushed for these unions through the courts. So it's being judicialized. In 2011, the Supreme Federal Court in Brazil ruled that civil unions should be recognized throughout the country. So we have, at that time we had civil unions. And in 2013, the National Council ruled that all civil unions should be recognized as gay marriages. So with the stroke of the pen, what we had is gay marriage being indirectly accessible to Brazilians. Chile is a non-case. Chile is, we're told, the country in Latin America that we should all try to emulate, given its record in socioeconomic progress. Chile has reduced poverty from 40% in 1990 to 12% today. It's the fastest reduction of poverty ever recorded in human history. So they've done very well there. But it is an outlier, or it is the non-case when it comes to sexual and, to gay rights. So Chile is a unitary system, which means the civil code is at the national level. They have just approved civil unions, and I belong to political scientists who believe that the study of politics is not scientific. We have a dismal predictive record. So I won't predict, but it's very unlikely that gay marriage is going to be approved soon, and I'll explain to you why. Colombia is the other case. Colombia has the Human Rights Court. It's a very active and very progressive court, and the process has been judicialized, but right now it's in a state of total limbo. So what we have is that gay marriage is not allowed. Gay and lesbians have pushed through the courts at the subnational level, and the case for gay marriage made it all the way up to this constitutional court. In 2011, it ruled that it was not up to the court to decide on gay marriage, that it was up to Congress. And it gave it 2 years to legislate on the matter. With the veto that has the Catholic Church and the evangelical Christians in the Congress, they tend to dominate the chairs of the important committees: Justice, Constitutional, and Family Committee. They were unable to get it through, right? And so the Senate, within those 2 years, did not pass legislation. What happened was that judges interpreted this as having the ability to offer gay marriages certificates out of their own. Because the court said that it had to rule, they had to legislate, and it didn't. The Attorney General of Colombia right now is somebody who's very conservative and decided to fight back, right? So he has deployed all resources possible to try to stop these judges from ruling on gay marriage. The court has made it back to the Constitutional Court, and within the next couple of years likely to rule, and is very likely to rule in favor. It's a very progressive, very liberal court. The last case that I detail a little bit is Mexico. So Mexico, what we had is gay marriage being approved in the capital city, Mexico City, 2010. Mexico is a federal system, and the civil code is administered by the states and the capital city, so 32 entities. Mexico City decided to reform its civil code in 2010. It approved gay marriage. And the then president of Mexico, from the Christian Democratic Party, the PAN, decided to challenge those reforms before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court came down with two rulings. The first one saying that Mexico City had the right to rule on this and that the reforms were constitutional. 2 weeks later, it came down with another ruling stating that, unlike the United States and DOMA, stating that all marriages contracted in Mexico City had to be recognized by other states. So indirectly, it became accessible to Mexicans. A couple other states, a very progressive state in the north, Coahuila, also approved gay marriage later on. Quintana Roo, where Cancun is located, that state activists realized that the definition of marriage in the civil code was gender neutral. So they say, well, actually, gay marriage was possible before. And what has happened in Mexico is that we don't have stare decisis, so jurisprudence. We have inter partes, which means that Supreme Court rulings apply only to the plaintiffs. Yeah, but you need a certain number of cases in a certain number of states in order to set universal jurisprudence, right? So there have been quite a few cases at the subnational level that made it to the court, and in May of this year, the Supreme Court ruled that every single civil code at the subnational level which did not allow for gay marriage was unconstitutional, right? So now you have marriage allowed available to all Mexicans. What we have here is that 62% of Latin Americans don't have access to gay marriage, right? Because these countries are the biggest in the region. So what I've tried to do, now that you have a bit of a glance, was explain cross-national variance. Again, so what explains that some countries have approved gay marriage and others have not. What are some of the explanations? The first one, of course, is modernization theory. Yeah. And here the idea is as countries become more developed, and however you want to measure development, they tend to adopt more modern values away from traditional values, right? They become more liberal, and then there's more support for gay marriage. The problem with that is that we don't have the data to look at that because gay marriage was not an issue 20 years ago, right? We have some crude measurements of this, and it's a very crude measurement based on the World Values Service, and that was adopted by the Latino Barometer, which is a very good survey that we have in Latin America since the mid-1990s. And the question here is, how comfortable, exactly what it is, how tolerant are you of having a homosexual as a neighbor? It's very crude, yeah? And we see that in 1999, it was 59% of Latin Americans say, no, I'm not comfortable, I don't tolerate that. That has dropped to 29%. So if we look at that time series, right, if you want to see progress, you need data across time. We don't have that, yeah, we don't have that. And that's all we have. What we do have is some recent polling that has started to be conducted in Latin America. This is a LAPOP polling by the University of Virginia, which measures for the first time specifically support for gay marriage, yeah? And this is from 2014. Where you see some countries are not quite as surprised. Uruguay, which is our little Holland, right? They've approved everything. Marijuana is legalized, abortion, euthanasia, express divorce, absolutely everything. It's pretty high up along with Canada, so they're right up there. And you see there's a huge variance in the region, right? From 67%, almost 7%, it's probably 7% now, all the way down to 5% in Jamaica. 5%, right? So what we have is a huge spread. What does it tell you in terms of modernization theory? Well, there's something to it, and I'm currently working on some public opinion data, and as much as I have fought against modernization theory, there's something to it. There seems to be some sort of correlation, right, between levels of development and support for gay marriage, right? The most developed countries are the ones on top, and you have higher levels of support for gay marriage. It is a correlation, but it is an imperfect correlation at best. Yeah, because what you have is some of these countries, Jamaica, Guyana, are a lot more developed than some of the Andean countries. Yeah, and support is lower in Andean countries. So there is some sort of correlation, but it's not perfect. Yeah. Furthermore, if you look at clusters, yeah, you have variance in terms of gay marriage. So if you look at the 5 most developed countries in Latin America, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Chile, you see quite a bit of variance. Yeah, and as I try to show you, you have variance in the way in the fact that gay marriage has been approved in some countries and not others, right? So what I try to do is I try to control for that variable by looking at countries that exhibit high levels of development. Yeah, and within those countries, you still have variance. So modernization theory does not explain it. What could explain it? The other one is a term that has been coined by a friend of mine, and I argue with her all the time at conferences, Elizabeth Freeman, who is in San Francisco, and she coined it progressive colonialism. And the idea here is that it is due to international forces. Yeah? One of the ways in which in IR debates, the way in which international forces have an effect on policy at the national level is through international regimes. Right? In gender policy, for example, gender quotas, domestic violence laws, a lot of countries signed up to treaties and they were forced to introduce legislation. The problem here is that we don't have an international regime for gay marriage. Right? We have an incipient regime for anti-discrimination legislation, but not gay marriage. There's no agreement around the world. In terms of movements, yeah, and the influence that international movements have had, my research shows that it has been very limited. First, what we have is that there's very little communication among activists within Latin America, yeah, and there's very little influence from the outside, from social movements outside. So my research shows that that has not been the case. Third, the other way in which some people argue that could be a possibility is as countries become more open, right, in terms of media, trade relations with world, they tend to adopt more liberal values. If that were the case, Chile would be the most progressive. Chile is a country in the world that has the most free trade agreements, right? It has the most open economy in the world and very high levels of traveling, and it does not have gay marriage. So in my book, I argue that has some limitations. Lastly is the pink tide, right? And that is the move to the left that Latin Americans experienced during the 2000s, right? When they exchanged neoliberals for social democrats at the ballot box, yeah? So the huge shift to the left that the region experienced, that some people argue, well, that would explain why you have the advancement of a variety of rights. What I argue is that it's a pink tide, it's not a velvet tide. And what you have is that wide, and I'm looking at Rosario, where's Rosario? There's a wide variance, right, of social democrats in Latin America, some of whom are actually, right, a lot more homophobic and intolerant than some of the right-wing governments. Yeah, and to give you an example, this is the famous quote that Evo Morales gave a couple of years ago. He apologized for that, but yesterday or the day before, a couple of days ago, because his Minister of Health is a woman, 30 years of age, and she's not married, he said at a news conference that she was worried that she might be a lesbian, right? This is the level of discourse in some of these countries, and that includes Correa, that includes Morales, that includes Chavez and Maduro, that includes Ortega, right? These people, the so-called progressives, are highly homophobic, right? And they have made just crazy declarations in public. So, and those countries have not advanced in terms of these rights, right? In some countries, such as Nicaragua, they have actually retrenched women's rights, right? Ortega has been atrocious in what he's done with women's rights. So that is not the explanation. So what explains it? Well, this is my argument. So what I argue in the book is that policy change is a result of the push by networks, and I deploy the term informal networks, right, built over long periods of time by gay and lesbians, right, on states, yeah, in countries in which you have meaningful access to the policy process and in which you do not have veto players, yeah, and the way they do it is through framing these arguments, right, in a manner that resonates with national debates. So I identify then three main factors, right? And what I argue is that gay marriage transpires when you have a confluence of the three factors. When the three come together, right, then you have a change in the dependent variable, which is gay marriage, right? So policy change. I'll explain each one of them by looking at my cases. Argentina. Argentina, right, has had gay mobilization since 1967, right? 2 years prior to the Stonewall riots, which is the birthplace or the mythical birthplace of the gay liberation movement in the United States. Argentines started to mobilize before, right? So this is nothing new, right? They've been pushing for rights for decades, yeah? In 1976, you had the coup in Argentina, so the movement weakened. But what we had was that some of the activists that went on exile continued to communicate and feed the movement with arguments and ideas. For example, the main activist in Argentina, Carlos Jauregui, had a PhD in history at the EHSS in France, and he actually was good friends with Michel Foucault. Right? He comes back to Argentina in 1983 when he returns to democracy, and he had some of the discursive tools start arguing that sexuality, ideas of sexuality are socially constructed, right? And challenging ideas of on morality. So what you have is an old movement which critically, since the very beginning, started to establish alliances with other social movements. Women's movements, human rights movements, intellectuals, and academics since the very beginning, right? You have the return to democracy in 1983, and the movement is very strong, yeah? And they start to push within the new democratic context for a variety of rights. How does that happen? Well, once gay marriage forms part of the priorities, yeah, they start to push for gay marriage, again, at the national level. One of the really interesting things about Argentina is that it does not have a confessional party. It's one of the few countries in Latin America that does not have a religious party. So the two main parties up until now, because a new party might win on Sunday, the run of elections. The two traditional parties have been the radicals, which have modeled themselves after the Conservative Party in England, so economically liberal and socially liberal. And the other one is the Peronist Party. Conservative actors, right, in Argentina, so the conservative forces have to go within those parties, but they do not have veto, right? And when you do research, you could pinpoint which members of Congress in the lower house and the Senate are evangelical Christians, are social conservative forces, actors. And you can pinpoint them. So what it means is that when they start to push for gay marriage, you do not have a veto player, right? It was not blocked. So here what I do and I try to present this in a least sciencey way. What I do in the book is I argue that this history of a story of agency, but also structures, right? And institutions are important in the way movements press for their demands. And here what I argue is that I focus on two main ones, is the concentration of power, federalism or unitary systems, and the political party system. So federalism and the type of federalism or type of concentration of power will determine the arenas in which these struggles are going to take place. And those arenas are filtered by the political party system. Like in Argentina, you don't have veto power. So they were able to push for reform without being blocked in Congress. And lastly, what I do here is I deploy the approach of framing that is used by sociologists to argue that what explained policy change in Argentina is that they were able to frame their arguments in a way that resonated with the master frames, so bigger social debates. And here in Argentina, the human rights frame has been intrinsic to the process of democratization, right? Because of the grotesque techniques that the military use, human rights has been central, right, to this idea of democratization in Latin America, in Argentina. And so what you had there was frame alignment, right? And just to give you a bit of a sense, these are the speeches, these are the debates during the debate that lasted 14 hours, right, in the Senate, before it was approved. Just to give you a sense of the debates. So what we have here then is really a debate about gay marriage is part of this idea of democratization, citizenship, democracy, and rights. Right? And what I do in my classes when I teach about this is think about how those debates have been framed differently. In the United States has been a debate about family, not about democracy or citizenship. Right? It has been a debate about family because family is critical to social life in the United States. For example, the debates about migration that have been taking place forever, right? It is not a debate about citizenship. It's a debate about not splitting families, right? So a lot of the way active the equality movement in the United States has framed the debate is about family, right? And Kennedy's majority opinion for the ruling in June, he finishes off by saying everybody has a right to a family and marriage, right? And if you're not married, you're going to be miserable, something like that. A highly conservative approach, right? But it is about family. In Mexico, what you had is something very similar to what happened in Argentina, but at the local level, right? So Mexico we have is a federal system. So the civil codes are at the subnational level, and as I told you, it was approved in Mexico City. We had Mexico City is in 2006, the arrival to the mayoralty of a highly progressive individual who pushed for abortion, euthanasia, gay marriage, express divorce, so you can get divorced in 30 days. Makes life a lot easier. And so a variety of progressive ideas. And he came in with the idea, for geographers here and those in urban studies, the idea of the right to the city. That became very big in the turn of the century, right? And he developed 5 axes, one of which was the city as a promoter of rights and third generation rights, indigenous rights, women's rights, and other rights. Yeah, he did not have sexual orientation as a right. But of course, activists saw this as an opportunity, right? And what you have here is that the Confessional Party of Mexico, the Christian Democratic Party, right, blocks everything. It's a party that was formed in the 1930s out of a rebellion in Mexico, specifically to defend Catholic values. Yeah, the PAN vetoes, right, but it can only veto when it forms governments, right? And since these debates take place at the subnational level, it can only veto and stop, right, when they form government at the subnational level. Since 1997, we had the first mayoralty election in Mexico. The PRD, which is the left-leaning party, has governed uninterruptedly, right? So what we had here is then the setup that was perfect, right, for gay and lesbian activists to push. And similar to what happened in Argentina, in Mexico City, going back to the early 1970s. So the gay movement in Mexico City starts in 1971. We had the first gay pride parade in 1979, right? 79, it's a long time ago, right? And they developed a network of individuals around the idea of sexual and reproductive rights, yeah? And so and the more I study politics, the more I realize that networks, relationships, especially in Latin America, are so important. They explain so much. And so they built this ad hoc coalition to push for gay marriage, and it was approved. And very similarly to what happened in Argentina, they latched on, or they very strategically decided to push for gay marriage by talking about human rights, democracy, and democratization, given that the mayor at the time was talking about Mexico as being a motor of democracy in Latin America. And just to give you a sense of how the debate unfolded. Oops. So what we have here is something very similar, right? So the argument about citizenship, democracy, and human rights. This is the city councilor that was the author of the bill. He pushed for the bill. Very smart. He has an MA in political theory from the LSE. He was talking about Marty Hassan, talking about John Rawls, right? But that's the level of debate. Yeah, and so a lot of councillors were unable to say no to this, right? It was framed in such terms in a context when a mayor was pushing for human rights and democracy. It was impossible, because they have majority, not to vote for that, right? So very similar, I argue. Chile. Well, Chile is a non-case in my comparison, right? The reason why Chile has not had gay marriage is because the three factors have not come together, right? You have two that might be crystallizing right now, but we'll see. The problem with Chile is, the thing with Chile is that the gay movement has historically been very, very weak. Right? You had a burst of activity in 1973, a couple of months before, I think May, a few months before the coup on September 11th, 1973, and it goes completely extinct. Right? Contrary to what happened in Argentina, Chile did not experience very heavy suppression of the gay movement. Towards the latter part of the 1980s, Pinochet, with this idea of very neoliberal, market-oriented idea, he allowed for some commercial establishments to allow for some socialization. But the movement you could not mobilize during that time, right? So the dictatorship lasted from 1973 until 1990, right? A critical period, because the 1980s was a time where a lot of these activists got funding for HIV/AIDS in Argentina, Mexico, right? And so you have at the beginning of democratization, 1990s, and the Chilean movement starts to activate. But they're not how to say behind, but they're doing such a different way. The first time they took on the streets in 1990, right? They wore masks. They were still afraid, right, of being openly gay in public, which in Argentina, Mexico, it was 60s and 70s, right? What happens in the 1990s is that you have a context of demobilization by the Concertación at the time, with the fear that they might go back to military rule, right? So demobilize society, right? And don't rock the boat. They agree on the economic model, yeah? But also what we have is that the leadership of the movement, right, is highly masculinist, right? They make the decision, first of all, not to talk about HIV/AIDS, right? To concentrate on civil rights, and not to make any alliances, especially the women's movement, which in Chile has been very successful, right? Furthermore, by the late 1990s, there's infighting with the movement, right, and it splits. So here we're talking about 2000s, when civil unions start to be adopted in Mexico City and Argentina, and you have no movement in Chile. And it's not up until the latter part of the 2010s, 2014, 2013, that you have another organization being formed, and I can talk about that later on, that you have the issue on the agenda. It really is placed on the agenda. Secondly, what we have in Chile, because of the electoral system, 2 minutes, I'll finish. I have one question. Yeah. What we have in Chile, because of the electoral system, which is a very complex system, a legacy from Pinochet, and I understand it, actually, it forces all political force in Chile to concentrate, to gravitate around two main coalitions. The Concertación, which is a left-leaning center coalition, which governed Chile from 1990 to 2010, and from 2014 until now. And the two main right-wing parties, UDI that identifies itself with Pinochet and the National Renovation Party. So two main poles, yeah? Within the left-leaning pole, what you have, this coalition, what you have is a Christian Democratic Party, right, which represents the interests of the Catholic Church. And it's a very important party in Chile. The fact that these coalitions, right, have to govern has meant that they have part of it has translated into a consensual type of policy making. Right? They have to agree among the various players within the coalition to push for policy. Right? The Christian Democratic Party has blocked almost any reform on moral policy. They blocked divorce up until 2004 in Chile. You don't have divorce before 2004, right? And when I talk to several cabinet ministers and staffers. They said, well, it's not even discussed because we're wasting their time, right? Because we meet, even before we say anything, they say, no, it's not going to happen. For example, right now, there's a therapeutic abortion bill being introduced in the Senate, yeah? The coalition needs all 5 votes from the Christian Democrats to push it, and 2 senators have said that they're not going to approve it. So that is a veto, right? That's essentially a veto. And so what you've seen is that within this consensual type of policy making, even within the more progressive pole, you've seen vetoed by the Christian Democrats, and they have continued to block it. And finally, the type of transition to democracy that Chile has experienced is very different from Argentina and Mexico. What I argue there in the book is that in Argentina and Mexico, you've seen is a larger debate about the terms of citizenship. What it means to be democratic, what it means to have full democracy, what it means deepening democracy and citizenship. That has not happened in Chile. The focus has been on socioeconomic growth, right, and prosperity. And up until 2010, we had the first student protests in Chile. They started to change a little bit the discourse. That was not debated, right? And Chile has been characterized by this technocratic way of looking at policy in all areas, yeah? And that has had an effect on the way it has been framed. So when the topic of civil unions started to be debated in 2005, when Bachelet was running for office, this is the way she framed it at the time. And Sebastián Piñera, during his campaign, he got elected and he governed from 2010 to 2014. So what we have in Chile is a different type of debate, right? It is a technocratic approach to these issues, and the argument was we need to regulate something that is a social reality. There are a lot of couples that don't have legal recognition, right? And we need to give them some legal support. But we're not debating democracy. We're not debating human rights. It's a very different debate. So what seems to be happening in Chile is that a new organization, a new NGO was formed in 2010. Directors of a good friend of mine. And they were able almost overnight to develop the networks and alliances that the Argentines and the Mexicans have developed over decades. So Pablo Simonetti, which is the second best-selling author in Chile, after Isabel Allende, of course, on a Sunday show, he came out saying, well, I'm actually it. And the news trended on Twitter for about a week. It was the news, right? Oh my God, Pablo Simonetti is gay. And so what happened almost overnight, you had the elite of Chile, right, focus on this, and they changed the discourse, right, completely. So now you have the elite, right, is not only the middle class. And a member of one of the most established families in Chile, Luis Larraín family, it's a very wealthy family in Chile, is the founder and now director, founded the organization, and he had all the connections, right, with the Chilean elite, both the political and the economic elite. And we have now is the board of directors of this NGO that has some of the main players in Chile, right? And it's a very successful, Fundación Iguales, it's called. It's a very successful NGO, and they were mostly behind the civil union reform right? So the first factor is starting to crystallize. The second we'll see, but it appears that we still have consensual politics in Chile, right? And the third factor, where I tell Lucho Larraín, I said, you guys should not debate, should not frame it as an issue of human rights and democracy. Frame it as the United States family, right? You don't talk about democracy, citizenship. Frame it as Americans have done, as a family issue, and you may have more resonance. Okay? So that's where Chile stands. Implications, where there's a lot of implications. And the reviewers wanted me to talk about all sorts of different implications. Well, the first one is, of course, that I think that policy networks is very useful to look at policy change. The idea of social movements, the concept of social movements, now people throw almost anything into it, and I think is limited, right? And I think the informality of these relationships and these alliances is important, right? When you interview people, they have the cell phones of, the top senators, right? And they say, do you want an interview with them? I have them myself. And they call them up. And it explains how some of these issues are pushed. I take seriously the idea of ideas. In my book, a little bit too much, I go all the way back, tracing heteronormativity to St. Thomas Aquinas and natural law. And even though the editor wanted me to cut, he said, no, that's staying. And the idea that in some of these debates, in moral policy debates, what we have is not just competing ideas, but really a clash of world visions, right? From the right, we have is the idea of family as foundational, as neutral, right? And from the left, of course, is this socially constructed. And they come to head to head. And I think it is important to trace how some ideas become prominent, right? And how some ideas actually trump other ideas over time, right? How competing ideas take more importance vis-a-vis other ideas. The ambiguous role of the courts as well. In all three cases, they were auxiliary, but were not the main motor to approve a gay marriage, right? These are debates that have been won on the street and by, as I say, harvesting votes. One of the tactics that the Argentines used, for example, was for legislators, the ones that were against or undecided, they would ask him to say publicly, are you against or in favor of gay marriage? But you cannot hide, right? And they go to the offices, open the door with the media behind. Are you against or in favor, right? Forcing them to take a position. So these debates are really, these policy reforms are really being won vote by vote. Two other points and I'll finish. The last one is I have a whole chapter on citizenship and the idea of sexualizing citizenship. And I think it's one of the contributions that Latin American gay activists and intellectuals, so theory and praxis, have made to debates on citizenship, right? So of course, following the work by feminists, Carol Pateman, etc., bringing down the socially constructed divide between the public and the private, right? So gender, of course, is private and public, but also so is sex, right? So this idea you have the hetero family, it's sexualized. There's no sex, right? Of course there's sex, right? And so sex as sexual relations and sexual identity, right, as part of being a citizenship, right? And they have really made a contribution to debates on citizenship. And lastly, development. Well, there is a prof in Amherst that has started to do some really interesting work. And what she has come up with is some really interesting data on the relationship that exists between countries that have anti-discrimination legislation and economic development. Right? That countries in which you have stronger anti-discrimination provisions, right, you tend to have higher levels of economic growth and human development, right? And this, of course, connected to the idea of capacities, Amartya Sen, etc. I don't think gay marriage is part of it, but some of the positive rights, some of the negative rights, right, anti-discrimination provisions, right, have a relationship, right, to development, and they have actually started to calculate in India, for example, in terms of the impact it has on GDP, the GDP growth, right, because you restrict people from moving freely in society, politics, and the economy. And that is it.
Okay. Jordi, would you like to moderate?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we've got about half an hour to go, and so the floor is now open to questions, comments,
Criticisms.
criticisms.
The good thing is that the book is published.
It's too late.
It doesn't.
Sure, David.
Question. Thanks, Jordi. Sorry for being late.
No, that's great.
Great,
I was late
great
too.
talk. Just a few questions, just from kind of a comparative politics background. One, the level of urbanization, whether that makes a difference generally. Two, the level of religiosity or religious conviction. And just so I'll open it up for others, the Pope, is he any good? Like, is that making a positive or no impact, or
The new Pope?
the new Pope? Yeah, not the old Pope, the new Pope.
The institution.
Yeah.
Yeah, urbanization is one of the variables. Of course, according to modernization theory and is social contact theory, right? So as more people that live in urban areas tend to have more contact with gay and lesbians, right? Which makes them more tolerant. So I'm working now on a series of articles of public opinion, and there's something there for sure. Yeah. So it is a variable in terms of explaining some of these policy changes. But the levels of urbanization in the country that I talked about is the same. It's very, very similar, right? And you have policy variance, right? So it's not a factor. So I isolate that by looking at a country that at similar levels of industrialization, education, urbanization, etc. Right? So it doesn't explain it. Religiosity is the same thing, right? So Uruguayans and Argentines are the least religious, right? So you say, well, of course, they're the most liberal. But Chileans and Mexicans have very similar levels of religiosity, right? And very similar levels of more social conservative evangelical Christians. So in Chile, it's between 14 and 17. Mexico is about 15%. Yeah? And you have policy variance. So there's more to that, right? The Pope, what can you say? The Pope, what you can say about the Pope is that it's very interesting. The Pope was the Cardinal of Argentina when the debate was taking place. They did not know that it was going to transpire so quickly. So they won the vote in the lower house. It went to the Senate, and that's when the debate really ramped up. Yeah, and they almost lost it. It was 39 to 29. Right? The president was making an official trip to China and took 5 senators. they were thinking about voting against, right? So there's a whole bunch of factors. However, when the vote went to the Senate, a letter that Bergoglio wrote to the Carmelites, of all nuns, the Carmelites are the least politicized, leaked to the media, right? And he had some rather incendiary comments saying, join the war. This is a war against evil, the machinations of evil. This is a war, you have to join it. And the president in China came out saying, this is ridiculous, not religious, right? It's a secular country. And so what he did actually, galvanized people more. And that is when the transnational community actually joined the cause, saying enough with this. Because of the perceived and somehow real relationship that the Catholic Church had with the military dictatorship. They were very close, very different from Chile. That relationship was a lot more confrontational in Chile. And so he actually had the opposite effect. Right? What happens now is that the issue of abortion is very likely to go forward, right? Having Argentine as a vote.
Interesting.
I'm curious because there's this clear link between social movements and networks and policy change. But what's the influence been like in terms of general public opinion in these countries? So have these networks had similar opinion or similar impacts on general public opinion about gay marriage or gay rights generally? Or has there been sort of a backlash, or what? Has that been similar across the countries?
After it was adopted or before? So the question is, have the networks have an impact on public opinion? Yes, at least through, it's interesting because I got the results of a survey that was taken out a couple months ago. We had a listed experiment on it, looking at frames. And so it's interesting. But what I would say is it's very difficult to measure. Yeah, that's something that's very difficult to measure. But what you say is that human rights frame had an effect on public opinion. But not public opinion, just in general, right? because the polls that came out were in urban areas, Buenos Aires, Rosario, Córdoba, Mendoza. So it was not really complete. But what they had an effect on is on the debates among the elites. That's the media, right? TV personalities that came in support, right? So that could have an effect, but it's very difficult to measure. Yes?
Kind of piggybacking on that previous question, why do you feel, I just want to hear your kind of comments and thoughts, why do you feel that family framing it in that structure is kind of such a strong impetus to pass it?
In Chile, why would it?
Yeah, family.
Well, because you don't have a debate about democracy, right? So the transition to democracy in Chile has not been about debating in terms of citizenship and democracy. That has not been, right? Only now we have is a little bit, not a lot, a debate about the constitution, right? So some of the authoritarian enclaves eventually left behind, they have to be removed. But it's not about participation. It's not about representation, right? It's very technocratic, yeah? And the debate in Chile is a very conservative society, right? Very, very conservative society. And so, and family, it's important in Chile, right? A lot more than in Mexico. Because in Mexico, 25% of households in Mexico are led by women, and they don't have a male, because they're in the United States, right? So I think that frame would likely have more of an effect in Chile.
Go ahead, Emma.
Okay.
Yep.
So I thought that the gay rights movement in the U.S. was framing it in terms of family, in response to conservatives in the U.S. framing being anti-family. So how are they? What's the anti-gay movement frame in Chile then? Is it already in terms of family, or did you just kind of?
Yeah. It's very interesting because these frames are actually developed very strategically, right, by both camps. And so they sit down, they run focus groups, which is going to resonate more, and they actually have subtleties to the frame depending on which sectors of a party you're going to go after for votes. So they're very strategic. In the case of Argentina, given that it's a very secular country, right, opponents to gay marriage have framed it in legal terms. And there is a sociologist in Argentina has coined the term, what is the point? Strategic secularism, right? To talk about, for example, when it was approved in the Chamber of Deputies, the Catholic Church came out, well, give them civil unions, but not gay marriage. Do something. And Chile has been about morality, right? What is the term that they use? Temas valóricos, issues of values, right? Morality. And so the Catholic Church, because he has enjoyed, up until the recent scandal, a lot of legitimacy, he has framed it as an issue of morality, right? This is just wrong.
So then the gay rights movement, they're still framing it in terms of rights, so they haven't really matched that frame?
And that's why I think that in the family framework, perhaps, but who knows?
Kind of sort of ask the same question, but maybe I'll just word it differently. So in countries where there has been a challenge or resistance to pass legislation, like Chile, for example, how significant were the roles of secular institutions, specific non-secular institutions, and even anti-gay right movements in trying to not pass legislation? Did you come across any resistance from them?
What do you mean by non-secular? Can you give an example?
Well, like churches, councils of clergy, ethnic-based interest groups,
right?
Religious-based interest groups.
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting. In the case of Argentina, because it has the largest Jewish population outside the United States, Canada, and Israel, of course, it's big, right? What we had is that the religious frame or the debate was actually shattered because you had some liberal rabbis coming in favor of gay marriage. You also had what they're called the historic religion, Protestants and Lutherans, that were quite progressive in Argentina and actually went in favor right? So the discourse that the Catholic Church was pushing was not dominant. In Chile, you have evangelical Christians, 15-17%, right? Very conservative. But what we have in Chile is the Christian Democrats. They don't have to mobilize much because they have the institutional framework and architecture, right? Institutions to veto. So you don't even need to mobilize too much because you have the Christian Democrats that they're right there, policy, and they veto every change. So you have not really had much mobilization on the ground because you have an institutional veto player.
Troy?
Professor Riddell. Oh,
yes. Brace yourself.
Jordi, sometimes we cruelly ask our PhD students about the scientific potential of politics and comparative politics in our key meetings. You started out by suggesting you're not going to make a prediction in some way about the future because we're bad at that. In terms of implications, you have society, you have ideas, you have institutions, so there's a lot going on there. I'm assuming my work is similar to yours in terms of explanation. Is this the best we can do in sort of, you throw a lot of things in, there's contingency, there's institutions, ideas, society, it's very hard to make predictions. Is that sort of where we're at in terms of comparative politics and political science more generally, or is there something more scientific?
it does sound like a Kiwi question.
You better pass.
I'm getting nervous. I have to go to washroom. No, yes, that's it. That really is it. So, in the conclusion, what the editor wanted me to do is to talk about how applicable this is to other cases, right? So I talk about Uruguay, I talk about Colombia, I talk about Brazil, but you never know. I mean, in Chile, they could not pass an anti-discrimination bill for a long time, right? I was in Congress for about 10 years, and they couldn't get it past that Senate committee, the Justice Committee. It was just blocked every single time they tried to pass it. What happens? Well, that 50-year-old, right downtown Santiago, Plaza Italia, smack right in the middle, gets tortured by Nazis and killed, right? So you have a overnight reaction to this, and the bill's approved within 2 months. Explains that. So I think that's the best we can do, right? So far my model is holding, but it's not going to hold forever. Something's going to happen. Okay, so yeah, in the case of Chile, the ones that pushed the debate was the right. It was the right. I was there during the elections. It was the first time that the word homosexual was debated in the presidential debates 3 times. The candidate from the right, and nobody would have expected this. The candidate from the right had some TV commercials during the campaign, holding a gay couple. Right, one of whom is a leader now at that NGO, and people were shocked. Why? This is the right. This is not supposed to be happening, right? Of course, there was a strategic component to it. So his campaign manager told me that it was they didn't consult with the partners. They just wanted to have a media reaction to portray the right as a modern right, inspired by David Cameron and England. But nobody would have predicted that, right? So yes.
Andy?
So I'm also an ideas person. I really love the power of ideas and all of this. But this isn't just a story about ideas, from what I'm hearing, right? Like of institutional design, networks. Like you have more concrete structures rather than just ideas. So I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about, are you giving primacy to ideas over these structures, or what is more important in this story?
All three.
All three.
All three. This is a story about agency, right? And so when in the chapter on ideas and citizenship, I do go back all the way to Thomas Aquinas, right? And I do go back to colonialism in Latin America, and one of and the 19th century, right? And one of the things that I explore there is that in as much as you had separation of church and state in some countries, such as Mexico, which according to me, Mexico and France, de jure are the most secular countries in the world. So complete separation of church and state. You have the idea of the family, right? That even though the church is taken away from many of its prerogatives, right? You have the idea of the family as a unit of society, making it into the Constitution, right? A foundational unit. Where does that come from, right? What idea is that, right? And it's vis-a-vis these ideas, right? That proponents of these rights have presented different ideas, and they have had success. For example, the Supreme Court ruling in the United States, right, asserts the idea of the family. It doesn't challenge the idea of family, right? So gay marriage, it's family, it's still there. The method that has been challenged. The Supreme Court rulings on several issues have, for example, said a family, first, is an evolving concept. Second, is one way of organizing a unit. Now we have common law, civil unions, and the family and marriage. Right? But the Supreme Court said, before you have this idea, you have basic sexual rights. And humans, right, and the citizens have the right to decide on their sex before they actually enter any of these possibilities to form a society. Right? That could not have been possible having challenged the idea of a family as a founding concept. So to answer your question, I guess they're important in the way the debates play out and how they frame, etc. But this is a story about agency.
And is it, sorry, can I just follow up? In all three cases, do you see it as a story about agency, or was it structures first in some cases?
Agency. It's always agency. His rights are not given, they're conquered. Governments don't want to touch these rights. They're too complicated, they're complicated issues, right? In Canada, the right to the Supreme Court, no back at you. You legislate on it. Paul Martin, you don't cherry pick rights. I think that's what he said. But he was forced. He was forced. Yeah, so governments do not want to touch these issues. The only candidate and the only party that has actually pushed for gay rights, for gay marriage, is Michelle Bachelet, part of the country. That's the only one, to my knowledge.
David?
Yeah, maybe it's a bit of an outlier question, but half my family's from Trinidad, so when you put up that slide, I was quite surprised.
Really?
In a way, I mean, I was thinking about it, and like maybe I'm not surprised, but I mean that's a country with a lot of oil wealth, so it's not a poor country. But what accounts for the high level of homophobia in the Caribbean? I know it's sort of probably outside of your area, but is there some causal factors that might explain that?
Some people have started to look at that, and now that I'm looking at public opinion, we're delving into that. Whether there is a relationship, perhaps Tori can help out here, but whether there is a relationship between legal traditions and tolerance, yeah, to some sort of causality. What you have is a correlation, but not causality. Yeah. In all these countries that were colonized by the British, you had homosexuality being criminalized, which meant that was criminalized in the public space. Yeah. In Latin America, we're criminalized in the private space. In the private space. What we had in Latin America is that the Napoleonic Code did not criminalize homosexuality, but some of the civil codes and criminal codes had affronts or offenses against public morality and customs or something like that. And that's what they used, right? So same-sex relations and sexuality was pushed to the private sphere. Yeah? Whereas in these countries, it actually was in the private sphere, right? Because a same-sex act at home is a criminal offense, right? So I'm thinking that has something to do with it, right? Because Trinidad is more developed than the Indian countries, Central American countries, but I think the legal tradition has something to do with that. And I don't know much about Trinidadian politics, but what you have in Africa is that these issues are just great to get support from 70. It's great to get support, to get people excited, and to find a scapegoat, right? So the domestic politics sometimes they rely on that, right, for political expediency.
Okay.
Globally, do you find there's a big difference between different colonies and their resulting public impressions of homosexuality?
So
just because you were saying like the British colonies legalized it or criminalized it in the public and private spaces. But did you see like historical differences between colonial strategies all over the place, or?
No, because I didn't look at the Caribbean countries.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so mostly continental Latin America.
I've got a question. It'll be short though.
Those are the worst.
Well, actually, it's not so short. I'm interested in the Economist article that you presented, this possibility and even the actuality of rights that have been extended for gay marriage and same-sex marriage, then being retracted. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the nature of entrenchment that's going on in these countries. And you talked about negative liberties and positive liberties. Like, what are some of the positive liberties that are now being guaranteed through rights in these countries, and how well entrenched are they?
That was a long question.
Yeah, it was. Sorry. Forget it.
So, entrenchment by implemented, yeah?
Yeah.
It varies. It really varies. The thing about, for example, gay marriage is that it's one of the rights that doesn't really need much implementation. So
Right.
you get married, that's it.
Right.
You sign a certificate, and that's it. Right?
But within marriage, you've got all sorts of rights and entitlements then that can...
Yes. So that varies.
Right.
In the case of Argentina, that's one of the things that I love telling my students. For example, we had universal health care. But universal health care. So if you, Per Johnson, go to Argentina and you get sick, you have the right to be treated by a public hospital. Right? So it's not just Argentinians, right? And so access to healthcare is already universal. So that's not different. In Mexico, what you have had is that some of the social economic benefits, pensions, healthcare, right, at the federal level. Yeah. So what you've seen over the last several years is that couples that get married in Mexico City have problems accessing some of those rights. There is some sort of backlash. And it has played out differently. Pensions and healthcare has played out differently because one had a very progressive leader that said no problem. The other one fought back, right? So in terms of implementation, in case of gay marriage, yeah, it varies. This is, of course, the pretty story, the nice story, right? Because Brazil has some of the highest hate crimes in the world. Right? One of the reasons is because we're the very few that actually tracks them. But I think, Tyler, what is it, 40% of hate crimes around the world are in Brazil, yeah? So those are, in terms of negative freedoms, they're a lot more difficult to implement because it's violence. Some states are very weak, some of the police forces are still corrupt. 4 weeks ago, an activist, trans activist in Argentina was killed, yeah? So now hate crimes has made it to the agenda. So it depends on the rights. But gay marriage, even within gay marriage, there's variance. But I think the more difficult to implement are the negative rights.
Right. So interesting. Any final thoughts or questions? Okay. Well,
Offer a beer.
Yeah, offer a beer. Thank you so much, Jordi, for a wonderful lecture.